good afternoon, everyone. I hope you are enjoying that relaxing music. As we transition from the wonderful panel we just had to this presentation, which will enable us to deepen on some of the themes that emerged in the panel that we just all participated in. So this presentation is called Recognizing Inequities in Trauma, Exposure and Response, Collective Trauma, Collective Impact, and Community Response. And we have the honor of having our presenter, Tammy Kazi Konate. She is a senior technical assistance consultant for the American Institutes for Research, or AAR. And with no further ado, I'll pass things on to her. The one thing I'll say before Tammy begins is the summit logistics. We want this to be an interactive conversation. We would love to hear your thoughts, your comments, and your questions for Tammy. So please feel free to use the chat. You all by now should know with Zoom, it's in the bottom of your screen. You'll see a chat button. If you want to ask a question, you can also click on the Q&A button right next to the chat. And also, if you need closed captioning, that is available on this presentation. What you need to do is go to the same bottom menu all the way to the right. You'll see closed caption. Just click on that and you'll get the closed caption. So with no further ado, I'll pass things over to Tammy.
Thank you so much, Shai. Well, good morning for some, good afternoon for others. I'm so pleased to be here with you today. And so Shai mentioned earlier that I'm with the American Institutes for Research, and part of my work there involves work with equity. And I work also at the same organization through the Center on Great Teachers and Leaders and through the Regional Educational Laboratories Southwest and Midwest. And so today, as we advance the slide, you'll see that we'll get a chance to really think about some very important areas of concern. So first, we'll try to better understand the definition and effects of collective trauma among adults and children. We'll try to delve into the research on inequities in opioid and related trauma exposure and response. And we'll identify supports that help us to inform a systemic response to the opioid crisis and the exposure and traumatic results that are coming out of that. Next slide. So just to take a moment to fully appreciate the context, I want us to just kind of remember the time that we're in. As we move to the next slide, you'll see that within the context in which we live, childhood trauma due to the exposure to opioids in America is really taking a toll on our young folks and all of us. Almost 9,000 children between the years 1999 and 2016 died from prescription drugs or the illicit opioid drug use. White males in particular accounted for a majority of those deaths. But as I mentioned in our previous panel conversation, the opioid crisis is impacting families across generations. It's impacting families from all walks of life, rural communities, urban and suburban, from every race and ethnicity, from every socioeconomic status group. And so what's important to think about is while we lost a majority white males, fatality rates increased for Black children in particular, white females as well, but many others. Latina youth were impacted, Native American youth were impacted, and all youth were impacted, to be honest. Next slide. So here we get a glimpse at just 1 year. So we looked at from 1999 to 2016 in the previous slide, but in 1 year alone in our United States, 2.2 million children were impacted around the use of opioids. 1.4 million are living with parents, or were living with parents, I should say, struggling with opioid use disorder. 240,000 lost a parent to death. 10,000 had parents who were incarcerated for the longer term, and 325,000 were displaced from their homes and families, either living in foster care or with relatives that were not their parents. That may have been grandparents or extended family members. And then 170,000 actually had opioid use disorder themselves or ingested opioids accidentally. I mean, the toll is amazing. We'll go on to the next slide. So when we think about what this all means, it all really harkens back to trauma. And trauma is an emotional response to a disturbing event or series of events that overwhelms individuals and groups in terms of their ability to cope. And so when we look at this slide, we're really thinking of collective trauma. And as we walk through what's happening with our young folks, we know that it's community wide, it's complex, it's cultural in nature, it's historical, intergenerational, it's happening in mass, affecting multiple generations, and it's all occurring simultaneous with what we called earlier the syndemic. Let's go on to the next slide. So here, who exactly is it that's being impacted? Well, I mentioned earlier that everyone is impacted, but there are five special populations of people who seem to really experience the impact more drastically than others. Of course, we have adolescents and young adults. We have individuals who are justice involved in the juvenile or criminal justice system. Individuals from rural populations, we find that veterans tend to have a very challenging time with this crisis, and also persons who inject drugs. And so those individuals, those particular groups, are especially vulnerable for a number of reasons. Some of the reasons have to do with access to treatment, access to care, stigmatization associated with opioid use disorder, and other things such as economics, location, rurality has been a major challenge. And so, what societal effects result? Well, when we think about how those things are impacting us as a larger society, we see a number of things. For example, we see that this parental incarceration is a major challenge for young people and their extended families. Increased unemployment and not being able to care for oneself results in other kinds of ills such as homelessness. We talked about foster care involvement, stigmatization, and then there's exposure to violence and also the increased risk for substance abuse. On to the next slide. So we think of these as three in one, three pandemics in one, the syndemic. And as we think about these, we know that the burden of the trauma related ills is being exacerbated by the concurrency, by the cascading effect, if you will. And so when all of this comes together and we move, I want us to just take a minute and think about this. Like when we think about this layered and complex encounter here, what does this mean for a student who's lost a parent or who's being impacted by exposure to opioid use? And as we think about that, I just want you to think about what supports you're offering in your particular role and what type support your organization is offering. So think about where this works and where how it fits for your organization and for you individually. Just keep that in mind as we move ahead. And so as we move to the next slide, which you've seen before, we know that this experience that we're encountering shows up in the form of a global pandemic. But at the same time as we have the global pandemic, we're having a national opioid epidemic, right? And then we're having that racial and race based historical trauma to kind of accompany that. So we see as we click that this cascading collective trauma is showing up as a series of compounding catastrophes. When I think about those catastrophes, we can name multiracial protests, social unrest, political divisiveness. We've had extreme weather events. We've had brutal killings. And so, not only that, but as we click again, we'll see that these particular events harken back to the historic. So there's a history in our nation around some of these. Even as we look at the opioid crisis, it has a history that is racial in nature. And then when we click again, we'll see that these emotional responses that we feel are ignited, they're renewed with each new exposure to a triggering event. And so as we think about these colliding, cascading, triggering events, I want us to also be mindful of how we're experiencing them as adults, how we think young folks are experiencing them, and where it is that we can intervene. Next slide. And so I wanted to walk us through each one of those pandemics. And first, we look at systemic racism. So, racism has recently been classified as a public health crisis. The first time that happened was in 2019. And in 2019, Milwaukee led the way. But since then, a number of other municipalities have declared this as a public health crisis. And Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin have been a few of the others involved. Also, the CDC has talked about it as a public health threat because so many lives are being lost. So there's this persistent trend of inequitable access to healthcare, housing, employment, education. There's bias in the justice system. And then there are these health inequities and social determinants of health that cause our mortality rates to shrink. And so systemic racism, again, is showing up in a number of ways. Police assaults, we've seen the US detention of child migrants, we've seen anti-Asian rhetoric and hate crimes on the rise. And again, I mentioned earlier, 20 million people participating in demonstrations just last year. There's a public outcry. Next slide, please. And so we move to the second pandemic. Um, it may not be second in terms of importance, but we'll just look at this like our foundations as a nation have been shaken, but not only nationally, locally, and internationally as well. So we have this increase in mortality rates, rising hospitalization rates for youth. At one point, only 3% of children were dying as a result of COVID. But in the last several weeks, we've seen in, I think, about 83% of those hospitalizations were children. We've seen this vulnerability in terms of food security, housing security, job security. We know that there's educational and digital access challenge. So our children are not always able to get access to education. And if it requires virtual means, they may not have digital connectivity or devices. And finally, the post vaccine prevalence of the Delta variant has brought about a new surge of challenges and concerns. Next slide. And so finally, when we think about the opioid crisis, there are waves of the crisis that we must think about. And as we think about these waves, I want us to continue to think about equity and inequity and how this is showing up in terms of response and access and even representation. So in this slide, what we see is how the first wave of the opioid crisis started in the 1980s with the crack epidemic. And at that time, we used language that was very different. We had a different mindset about individuals who were experiencing use disorder, substance use disorder. And we referred to them often as crackheads, their children as crack babies, those who were using and selling drugs as super predators, even rock slingers or thugs. And the sentencing rate for an individual caught with crack cocaine versus one caught with powdered cocaine was like had a 100 to 1 ratio. And so this was a criminalization period where people who struggled with the same kinds of use disorders we're hearing about today were incarcerated and were treated very differently. Many of those people belonged to urban areas and were African Americans and Latina. In the 1999 to 2004 era, we saw that overprescription of opioid drugs was taking place, and this affected suburbia often. And you started to see a shift in the way people thought about it because these were hardworking people getting access to opioids through their doctors and their pharmacies, and there was an overprescription and there was a sense of compassion that started to be expressed. In 2005 to 2011, there was the heroin addiction that kind of grew out of the overprescription era. And then finally, 2012 to present, we see synthetic opioids. But now we hear language that's different. We see people really poised to treat medically this concern as a malady, a medical challenge, and we see less of a tendency to want to crack down on crime and more of a tendency to want to make available access to the needs, the treatment needs that people have. Also, when we moved past the overprescription era, we moved into a more rural focused, in terms of geography, group of individuals who were suffering. And some of these were individuals, again, middle working class folks who were really just trying to manage. And so you have this sense of humanity now with humanized individuals who are not just kind of caricatures of the reality that we know them to face. In the next slide, I want us to think about what all of these three mean together. Race, systemic racism, the pandemic, and then the opioid crisis. First of all, we know that when we click the button, we know that this impacts groups psychologically. So in each case, when we look at them individually or separately as pandemics, we see that they have those triggering events have the capacity to impact large groups of people. The next bullet tells us that the collective memory of those groups is impacted in such a way that to grapple with these triggering events, we try to figure out what exactly happened, who was at fault, and how we can make sense of them. In the next bullet, we understand that this emotional connection occurs because we are sharing this collective response to a collective set of encounters. And we become much more aware of one another as individuals. Sometimes that awareness may help us to engender feelings of empathy. Other times it overwhelms us and we feel more hopelessness, as the last bullet directs us to think about the emotions associated with collective trauma, which include helplessness, loss, uncertainty, and grief. Next slide, please. So, how are these events that trigger trauma being experienced by our children? If we look at the bolded examples in particular, we see that these are things that are happening in real time every day. Community and school violence, natural disasters, or terrorism, refugee or warlike experiences, sudden or violent loss of loved ones, and the serious accidents or life-threatening results of illness. Every child that we know is experiencing at least two of these, right? So we've heard about the wildfires, we've heard about flooding, mudslides, we've heard about the children who are in these refugee camps. We've known that there so many people have suddenly lost a loved one to COVID, and that life-threatening illness is imminent every day among us. So what does this look like for youth? How are our youth managing? Let's go to the next slide. So in terms of the overall impact on education, which is where we'll start, the first bullet is really to help us think about academic outcomes. So academically, negative home and community factors are increasing learning loss. Childhood exposure to opioids is resulting in underperformance. And students who are directly and indirectly experiencing drug related deaths are faring the worst in terms of academic performance. And I know we should not be surprised at that. And then in the next bullet, we talk about geography, geographic location. So we find that in the literature where there are higher levels of and incidences of violence, children are underperforming even more. When there is rurality involved, there seems to be a connection between rural locations and underperformance. And it may have to do with limited access, it may have to do with isolation, it may have to do with the difficulty to provide some of the access to resources because of the distance between homes and schools and neighborhoods. In the next bullet, we learned that poverty has great bearing on education. And none of these things surprise us. But we know that in schools that are located in communities that produce limited revenue, there's less of a likelihood that the schools are able to gain access to the programming, the assistance, and the treatment that students may need. Also, when it comes to students experiencing poverty, the same is true. They are somehow almost excluded from the process of getting the supports they need to thrive academically before they can have a fair shot at education. Next slide. So, how are we working as a community? How are we working together to mitigate the impact of trauma? Well, there are so many things we can do, but as you see these hands coming together in this picture, I think this is one of the most important emblems and systematic approaches to take. And that is coming together collectively, inclusively, and strategically. And the next slide, what that means is that we must begin to reconsider the systems that are in place. Those systems, in many instances, can offer us protective factors that will help to mitigate trauma. If we will just kind of revisit our systems and refine them in such a way that we move away from the punitive, we move away from those that are disparate and focused on inequity, and really harness what we know about life, about cultural competence, about social emotional learning and well being, we will see that we would be able to overcome some of the racism, ethno-violence, and marginalization that our youth are experiencing. And we'll also be able to challenge this socio-political climate of despair and violence. That's one of the things and one of the ways that we have seen in the research is that there's something associated with religiosity, for example, that lowers the use of opioids apparently in adolescents, not all, but in white adolescents in particular. So this connection, the spiritual connection, religious connection means something very important for young people. Also, the notion of perceived associated risks. The research has shown that whites and Hispanic children, in particular adolescents, respond to this notion of, are there risks associated with this? And what can I do to reduce the risk? And finally, Black adolescents are responding to strong parental bonds. Those whose parents have strong views against opioids and other drugs appear to be less likely to use. So our voices count as family members, as parents, as adults who have influence over youth. Our voices and our belief systems count. Let's go to the next slide. The next slide, we see that we are looking at what is called ACEs, And we'll click one time, adverse childhood experiences. Those adverse childhood experiences are associated with abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. The study that these grew out of took place 20 years ago. And 20 years ago, this was kind of normed on a set of white middle class adults who were in their 50s. And we learned so much about instances in childhood that had lingering effects for adults. But one of the things that, as we've revisited the ACEs study, we found out that positive childhood experiences were overlooked. And so let's click on that. These positive childhood experiences are so important because they draw our attention to strategies that we can use every day in our interactions to support students in overcoming adversity, in overcoming trauma. So, the ability to talk about their feelings, to feel supported in difficult times, to participate in traditions in the community, to have a sense of belonging and a place at school where they feel welcomed and a part, to have the support of friends, to have adults who are not their parents, but who care for them, and to feel safe in their homes are all things that really mitigate the impact of trauma. Next slide, please. So, here, as we think about what's in ACEs, we also need to know that something else was left out, and that is the adverse community environment piece. So when we looked at rurality and poverty and race and how those things came into play with regard to trauma, they were not included in the original study. So the original study calls us to be much more aware and conscious of cultural responsiveness and cultural competence. Here we learn that poverty, discrimination, community disruption, a lack of opportunity, and housing challenges, access challenges, and violence impact the way children process trauma. So we'll move to the next slide. In the next slide, I want us to think about how we all respond to traumatic events. So there are three responses that are human, right? Fight, flight, and freeze. Our brain, the amygdala, takes us to a place where when we sense that we're at risk, certain chemicals, stress related chemicals, are produced to help our bodies react appropriately for our own survival. Some of those responses cause us to show behaviors that actually show up in our classrooms. So when a child is in the fight mode and you hear crying or clenched fists or feelings of anger, in the flight mode, movement, anxiety, a sense of being trapped or feeling fidgety and tense, and freezing. We've all heard about the deer stuck in headlights move, where there's this like this frozen look. You're holding your breath. You're sensing dread. All of those things, next slide, please, have a certain appearance that we might know very well. So when we see that students in the fight mode are aggressive, outrageous, violent, angry, obnoxious, we shouldn't be surprised because these are natural responses to being in trauma. These are results of toxic trauma. When we see children who are apathetic, sleeping, silent, withdrawn, they may be in that freeze mode. Okay. And so flight mode are the ones who can't sit still. Maybe they might be stopping, like running out of the classroom, not returning on time. These are things that we see as extremes, and we can do something about these. Let's go to the next slide. So the brain has a level of plasticity, which means it can change. We were taught some time ago that, brain cells, once they were lost, there's nothing we could do. But the brain has protective and compensatory factors that enable it to really recuperate from great toxic stress. And some of the ways that it recuperates are really based on these PACEs, if you will, protective compensatory experiences, including unconditional love, friendship, mindfulness, and so forth. In the next slide, and I know we're really low on time, I want us to be reminded of a process that I refer to from my book called to Sankofa. And Sankofa is an African word that means it is okay to go back to the source and fetch valuables that were left behind. And so in this process, I challenge all of us to tap into the strengths around us, tap into the sources of strength that you have in your local community. This is a community response piece. And in doing so, begin to think about areas of focus that you have where you want to use those strengths to be able to address focal points through action. And then as you act, always honor and value social justice and humanity. That's the way we want to transform. In the next slide, I'll give you 4 steps to that process. Number 1, challenge marginalization. And we can do that through number 2, interrupting master narratives that call the event as something that is really different from what it was. Maybe those narratives we see in social and mass media are somewhat accurate, but they miss some really key elements, or they use stereotypes and generalizations that harm. In the third step, empower and arouse agency. You have to act. We have to act as a collective and as individuals to create a transformative space, one that gives us inspiration and hope for the future, one that gives our young people something to hope for. And finally, as we do so, we want to attend to the culturally affirming piece and make sure that the solutions we develop are sustainable. In the next slide, I ask us to change our paradigm, shift our paradigm of readiness, rather than thinking of whether our students or the communities we serve are ready for the support we have to offer. Let's think about the extent to which we are ready to better meet their needs. In the next slide, I'll offer you this ready framework, and this framework grows out of work done by the Center on Great Teachers and Leaders, and I'll put the link in the chat box. And this link will enable you to really think about deeply and do some work around the notion of whether or not the resources that are being provided are sufficient. Are there deficiencies, and have you been able to address those as an organization? In terms of beyond the deficiencies, are educators who are supporting the youth provided the necessary resources, professional learning experiences, and supports they need to do their work effectively? What about accountability requirements? Do the policies that exist support or form impediments to what you really want to do? And in terms of working conditions, are there disparate conditions? Are teachers treated equitably? Are you really tapping into their talents and expertise and valuing them in a way that's tangible? And then finally, the implementation capacity of staff. Are they able to do what they are charged to do? And if not, how are you building that capacity? So I would really offer you this opportunity to pause and think deeply about those strategies, the communal strategy, the Sankofa strategy, and the Ready strategy. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Tammy. So we're running out of time. Thank you for all of you who are staying over. If you have any questions, feel free to email Tammy. Here is her email address. I hope you don't mind, Tammy, encouraging people to send you questions. Very briefly, I'll say we have 3 exciting things coming up next. We have a brief break from 1 to 1:30 Eastern time, where you can try the mindfulness meditation moment, and the link is there now on the chat. We're then going to go into interactive workshops around the action agenda that we've put together as part of this as part of the summit. And doing that, you'll get to pick which one of these 4 strategies you will focus on. So again, go to the agenda, and the link is there on the chat now, and choose which of these strategies interest you the most to engage with us in interactive agenda. And then we're going to close the day with our keynote speaker, Joel Restusha, who's going to be talking about how to create trauma-sensitive schools for all students. So again, thank you so much, Tammy, and thank you all for joining our session. If you have any questions about anything related to the summit, please feel free to email the CSOC email address on the screen and in the chat. Thank you.